culture, and the individual poems were short enough that even the weaker students were able to develop a mastery over them. The girls came into the year angry that they had to do poetry for the first time at year 12 when they hadn't really been exposed to it before then. Because in my experience, even English teachers struggle with and avoid teaching poetry. However, by the end of the year, at least some of them felt confident enough to write on the poems in their final exam. And when thinking about poems, I'm also reminded of the experience of teaching year 8, both to read and write poetry, and having to consistently repeat that the essence of poetry is not a rhyme at the end of the line, but the meaning making that is contained within the phrases. In that case, poetry was definitely more pain than pleasure, but there were still moments of joy. My own love of poetry started when I had the opportunity to study the works of Sylvia Plath in my senior literature classes, and her words have stayed with me and emerged at key moments, speaking to my soul. Poetry may seem like a pain to the uninitiated. However, it can also afford untold pleasure when it speaks into our own lived experience, and I believe this is true of the Psalms as well. So the Book of Psalms is effectively a collection of 150 poems. Traditionally ascribed to David, scholars now believe that most of the Psalms were transcribed, if not predominantly written, within the exilic and post-exilic periods when the ancient Israelites were grappling with questions of why Yahweh would allow them to be displaced from the promised land, and what society should look like for the returnees. They are thought to be compositions by the temple scribes for use in the Second Temple worship and liturgical practices. However, there is very little extant evidence to confirm or deny this, or elucidate the exact way they were used within this context. So at this point, it's important to note that when we're talking about the Psalms as a collection, there is a great variety within the individual texts that make up the Book of Psalms, particularly in terms of authorship, terms of date of composition, date of transcription, which may differ significantly from the time of composition, and many other historical details. The Psalms themselves do not contain many specific historical details that allow dating or point toward particular authorship, and the superscriptions that may be seen to contain this information are probably a latter editorial addition. In fact, David Wilgren Davidge suggests that we should, quote, treat them, the superscriptions, as snapshots of a dynamic process of attribution and transmission, unquote. In terms of Psalm 71, which I'm looking at in my thesis, a superscription has been clearly added in the Septuagint manuscripts that doesn't exist in earlier records. This is probably because it's one of the only Psalms in what is called Book 2 that doesn't have a superscription. And the addition of a superscription aims to situate Psalm 71 within this wider collection. So the Book of Psalms is thought to be made up a number of small collections, namely 5 books that reflect the fivefold division of the Pentateuch. And these smaller collections were brought together at some time in the Common Era. The manuscripts from Qumran, which are dated between 300 BCE and the 1st century of the Common Era, contain copies of many Psalms, and these differ from the Book of Psalms as we know it. There is different ordering, there's Psalms not included in the collection, and sometimes there's different verses and combinations. So this demonstrates that the Book of Psalms, the texts that are included, the order and their final forms was not stable at this point in history, or at the very least within this community. Gerald Wilson notes that until approximately 50 CE, there was still a looseness, his words, in Psalm arrangements, but that it probably died out soon after this. The collection of 150 Psalms that we now have also shows different numbering of Psalms between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, and this is also sometimes reflected in modern translations as well. This is because some Psalms have been split or combined against diverse manuscript traditions. The numbering of individual verses can also be variable, with some manuscripts including the superscription in the numbering and some starting with the Psalm proper. Psalms is one of the most attested books of the Bible throughout history and has a large number of manuscripts that record variant traditions. This makes it a rich topic for scholars, but it also means that it's difficult to make sweeping or definitive claims. Therefore, when I'm speaking about the Book of Psalms as a collection, I'm referring generally to the collection as presented in modern biblical translations. The term Psalter is also sometimes used as synonymous with the Book of Psalms. However, I think it's more accurate to speak of specific psalters, such as the St. Helena Psalter pictured here, which denotes a particular version of the Psalms. This version is one that seeks to eliminate all references to God as He and to reduce masculine imagery within this translation. It was developed by and for the use of a group of religious sisters, and it notes in the introduction that this translation also prioritises a balance between inclusivity and singability.
Mm.
The English word psalm is derived from the Greek word psalmoi, not a Greek scholar, so just bear with my pronunciation if it's wrong. And that means music, while the Hebrew word for this book is Tehillim, meaning song or hymn of praise. Both of these point to a tradition of setting these poems to music, although it's unclear whether this was an intentional part of their composition or emerged with later usage. Of course, in modern contemporary use, there are traditions like the Presbyterians who only sing psalms, and other traditions who use the psalms predominantly in a spoken form. Most formal liturgies include at least one reading taken from the psalms, and more informal liturgies often include a psalm as a song. The most common factor here, the common factor here is the performative and ritual nature of the reproduction that takes place within communal worship. The Psalms are also an integral part of the Catholic Breviary and the Anglican Daily Office, which can both be performed publicly but are also often undertaken as part of a daily private devotion. Indeed, Gerald Wilson, in the editing of the Hebrew Psalter, claims that, quote, "The Psalter is a book to be read rather than to be performed, to be meditated over rather than to be recited from," end quote. Now, I don't agree with this perspective, and I believe that it limits our appreciation of the Psalms. However, this understanding is drawn from the idea that Psalm 1, which was a later addition to the collection, is designed to point to the way Psalms should be understood. So verses 1 and 2 of Psalm 1 read, and this is the NIV translation, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night." So we see in this second verse the twofold use of the word law, Torah in the Hebrew, to emphasize the idea that the words of the psalm should be understood as a commentary on the law, which teaches young men to separate themselves from the wicked by focusing on the teachings of Yahweh. Now, I've deliberately used the phrase young men here because the first line is literally blessed, Ashari, sometimes translated as happy. Blessed is the man. And this is a good reminder that these texts were written within a patriarchal culture where men learned Torah, the law, and women did not. It is presumed that the Psalms were written for men, and eminent Psalm scholar Erhard Gestenberger goes so far as to say that the Psalms were written by men for men. However, some scholars suggest that at the very least, Psalm 131 might have been written by a woman. Obviously, as a female Psalm scholar, I reject the notion that the Psalms were written only for or are applicable just to men. Indeed, my central thesis question asks, what if this Psalm was voiced by a woman? The mention of enemies in this very first verse is also important, and I'll return to this idea toward the end when I'm discussing offensive or difficult parts of the Psalms. But to sum up this first section, the Psalms are a collection of poems that have been used for about 3,000 years as liturgical texts and contain a wide variety of diversity between the individual texts. I next want to move on to the idea that this is Hebrew poetry. There are some scholars that claim that poetry as a form doesn't exist in ancient Hebrew. However, even in the earliest manuscripts, there is evidence of the shorter lines that we might associate with the poetic form. So this is a picture from my BHS Bible from the book of Jeremiah. And I hope you can clearly see on the left-hand side of the image, in the middle, the lines look more like poetry than the prose blocks that surround it. And just like the poetry that we're familiar with, Hebrew poetry uses imagery and metaphor to convey ideas. It has wordplay, rhyme and assonance, and it employs brief phrases to articulate the point. Scholars today suggest that it doesn't have fixed meters like classical Western poetry, but there is some debate over whether it did originally contain rhythms that have been lost in translation. Indeed, there are many elements that become lost in translation, including the way some metaphors and sayings worked in the ancient Near East, not to mention what we consider today to be unusual linguistic choices. One example of the way contemporary readings of Hebrew metaphor are misunderstood and misused is demonstrated through the abortion debate and the rhetoric and understanding of when life begins. Frequent reference is made to Psalm 139:13 that says, "For it was you who formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb." The Hebrew word for womb here is beten, and it's one of 3 Hebrew words that can be translated as womb. When we look at the usage of these 3 words, we find that beten usually refers to the time of pregnancy, rehem is used for things like conception and birth, and me'eh refers to offspring. They all mean womb, but the nuance of womb is slightly different for each one. The ancient Israelites would have been able to see evidence of the child growing in the mother's womb and were aware of the connection between planting the seed, as it were, and conception. However, to argue that this is evidence of their understanding that life begins before birth is anachronistic. In fact, Othmar Keel, author of the most comprehensive ancient Near East text on symbology, suggests that there may be a connection between this imagery in Psalm 139 and the birth narrative of the Egyptian king. The life course of the king was far removed from ordinary men and indicates a special relationship to the deity, which was not applicable to most others. Furthermore, Keel states that the reference to God's divine role at the suppliant's birth is intended to remind God of his responsibility for his creature. God brought him, the psalmist, into being. God ought not now permit him to die destitute. The time in the womb is linked to a temporal understanding of life that spans from first breath to last. And in this way, the womb of pregnancy finds its counterpart in the womb of the earth once the psalmist is dead and has been buried. Both are dark, hidden places of the netherworld and represent a poetic and metaphoric bookending of life. It was not intended to be read as a literal or medical fact, and it should not be read as such today. And this is a good reminder that we must always mind the conceptual gap when looking at these ancient texts. One feature that remains evident in translation is the use of parallelism. Parallelism is the use of 2 or 3 lines that have corresponding meaning. And the corresponding meaning can be additive or deepening the metaphor, but it also may contain a contrary understanding. This contrariness can often be seen in the proverbs such as "a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." In terms of the Psalms, in Psalm 26 we see, "Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity, and I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. Prove me, O Lord, and try me, test my heart and mind, for your steadfast love is before my eyes, and I walk in faithfulness to you." So in verse 3, the psalmist draws a parallel between steadfast love and faithfulness, and between having something before my eyes and to walk in something. The 2 lines have a similar meaning, but the second line also draws upon and extends the meaning of the first line. What was just in sight becomes the psalmist's actions. Further, the steadfast love that remains in sight allows the psalmist to walk in faithfulness. If we read the Hebrew, there's also a chiastic structure within this verse, which might encourage us to render this verse, Vindicate me, O Lord. Oh, steadfast love for you is before my eyes, and I walk to you in faithfulness. So the steadfast love of Yahweh, the steadfast love and faithfulness of Yahweh surrounds the psalmist, presenting a picture of security and mutual reciprocity within this relationship. This statement might evoke the common psalmic imagery of Yahweh as a refuge and a song fortress in which the psalmist is enveloped. In verse 2, we have a similar parallel structure between proving and testing. And it's worth considering how the parallel between me and heart and mind, literally heart and kidneys, is to be understood. The sentence structure here in the translation is similar to the Hebrew. So there can be comparisons drawn between the sort of straightforward statements in this verse when contrasted with the enveloping structure of verse 3. When we bring verse 1 into consideration as well, we can see a pattern where a vocative is employed to call upon Yahweh to vindicate the psalmist in verse 1 and to prove the psalmist in verse 2. And we can understand proving as showing that the psalmist is innocent because the psalmist has remained loyal to Yahweh. And the reason is given in verse 3 because the psalmist has remembered Yahweh's faithfulness and steadfast love. So the rhythm of the first two verses with clear, straightforward statements changes in the third to a warm embrace. A reader presenting these verses would do well to pay attention to this shift of mood or emotion to assist the hearer to discern this movement within the text. Verse 4 of this psalm shows a subtle change in perspective as the psalmist moves to a series of I declarations while still engaging with this theme of calling on Yahweh to see the psalmist's goodness. The whole psalm is a development of this theme where the psalmist protests his innocence before the court of Yahweh, that Yahweh may not count the psalmist among the wicked and therefore may preserve the psalmist's soul. Now, you might have noticed my intentional and repeated use of the word the psalmist. As a feminist scholar and following the work of Marjorie Proctor Smith, I believe it's really important to think about the impact of our words in worship and liturgy. As noted, the Psalms can be received as heavily male-centric, and this can be reinforced through the unthinking use of masculine pronouns to refer to the psalmist. This, along with male pronouns automatically applied to God, can make the worship and liturgy very uncomfortable for women, particularly those who've been the recipient of violent or abusive behaviour at the hands of men. So being intentional about removing masculine pronouns, both for the psalmist and for God, is an important step to recognising that women and gender diverse people are valuable within the church and within our worship practices. And this is also a good time to think about translations. Obviously, if you can read the Hebrew, then you're in a better position to evaluate a given translation. However, I do understand that this is not practical or possible for everyone. And the next best thing is to be aware of different translation practices and how that impacts the way a psalm is rendered. This is particularly important for the Psalms because many translations, like the St. Helena Psalter I mentioned earlier, have placed an emphasis on the rhythm of psalms in English, which can make them easier to read, sing responsively, but which may diverge from the Hebrew text. Some translations are intentionally inclusive, deliberately removing references to man as a shortcut for people and replacing masculine pronouns with the neutral they, or alternately, changing speech to the first or second person to avoid the use of gendered pronouns. The ESV has deliberately increased and emphasised masculine language as a reaction to the inclusive movements of translation, such as the NRSV. Now, I'm not suggesting here there is a right translation or even that the original meaning can be completely discerned. As with all poetry, there's an element of ambiguity within the writing that allows the words to speak to and be heard differently for each individual. This is part of the power of this form of writing. However, we do need to remain cognizant that there are translations that change and obscure the nuance in unhelpful ways. This is why I chose the NIV translation of Psalm 1 rather than the NRSV, because the nuances of Asheri are heard differently when we use the word blessed rather than happy. The ancient Israelite, to be blessed was to be happy, but that understanding is not necessarily conveyed in the word happy today, particularly within a group of diverse hearers. So for some of us, the translation will be contained by the prayer book or breviary that our denomination uses, and further by the lectionary that states which parts of the Psalms should be used on any given occasion. For those of us who have a choice, the Bible Gateway website is a really easy space to flick between translations and get a sense of the different ways a psalm can be rendered. There are also any number of psalters and translations that offer alternative readings and understandings. I am building a collection of these, including illustrated versions, so if you were looking at a particular psalm and would like some alternatives, feel free to get in contact with me. Before we finish this section about the poetics, I want to draw attention to the I language of the Psalms. The I of the psalmist can be individual or collective, and demonstrate that these words are spoken to God from a human perspective. This is not just thoughts, but the I represents an embodied voice that speaks from a lived experience. The power of the Psalms comes, at least in part, by the ability of listeners to hear themselves, their emotions, their doubts, their fears in the eye of the psalmist, and to find permission to speak the negative without fear of offence. Wallace notes that the psalmist maintains the conversation with God, even though the latter has fallen silent, believing that things can change, even God's mind. The cry is not simply for the deliverance of the psalmist and or the community, but for God to act as God has done before, in accord with the just, righteous, and compassionate nature of God, and in keeping with the existing relationship with the psalmist or the people. So the I voice of the psalmist is calling God to remember the I-thou relationship, in the words of Martin Buber, and the continuing covenantal connection between the psalmist and God. So I'd like to now move to performance factors of the Psalms. And the use of the word performance here does not connote a distinction between the performer and audience. Rather, it's used to refer to the presentation of the psalm in worship, including the actions of all participants, whether leader or congregation, clergy or lay. It also includes choices regarding the format of the psalm, responsive or monologue, spoken or sung, and as a response to other elements of the liturgy or as an independent unit. So first I'm going to discuss choices about its position and function within the liturgy, because to some extent this will inform the other decisions. In my experience, the Psalms are hardly ever preached on. The exceptions might be Psalm 23, especially at funerals, and Psalm 22 verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me, as part of the Easter liturgies. More frequently, the Psalms are used as an introit or as a response to the first reading. When used as an introit, a psalm of praise or thanksgiving is often chosen, and in the Revised Common Lectionary, the psalm is chosen for the way it responds to or complements the Old Testament reading. The consultation on common text in the Revised Common Lectionary notes that the psalm is, quote, a congregational response and meditation on the first reading, and is not intended as another reading, end quote. These choices mean that unlike the daily office, which works through the entire book of Psalms, the Revised Common Lectionary contains a collection of psalms that reflects the bias of the selection committee. Walter Brueggemann, in their book Israel's Praise, Doxology Against Idolatry and Ideology, states that, quote, the liturgy may be an inspired disclosure from heaven, but it also is a managed, administered, designed human process. Now, he was talking about the development of the liturgy within the Second Temple period, but his words are apt for the construction of modern liturgies also. So within the Revised Common Lectionary, there are some psalms that are repeated, some that are only partially included, and others that are omitted entirely. Howard Neil Wallace, in Words to God, Words from God, notes that in the Book of Psalms, lament and penitential psalms make up just over 40% of the collection. Hymns, psalms of praise in various forms, and psalms of thanksgiving or trust constitute about another 35%. However, in the lectionary, hymns and psalms of praise, etc., outnumber lament and penitential psalms about 2 to 1 in each of the 3 years. So I think there are 2 main points to draw out of this. Firstly, the permission to lament and be angry is lost within a liturgical rhythm that focuses only on praise and celebration. This possibly reflects a theology that's not comfortable wrestling with difficult topics like theodicy, grief, and perhaps justice, and a wider worldview that encourages an often false positivity. It's also symptomatic of many Christian responses that I've seen to the Royal Commission, where some sought and are still seeking to deny its critique of church systems, cultures, and clericalism. I would argue that a church that can include a full range of emotions within its worship and liturgical processes is one that will be more emotionally healthy. It will have the capacity to develop authentic community, and it will be better situated to protect the most vulnerable from abuses. Secondly, when the Psalms are used solely as a response, they're not valued for their own theological or prophetic insight. Their voice becomes a supporting chorus rather than contributing a unique message and understanding of God. Given that the Psalms are one of the few sections of the Bible that speak in the first person and provide language and rubrics for prayer forms, this can be seen as a problematic exclusion. The silencing of the voice of the psalmist, particularly their doubts and fears, may communicate to the worshipper that church is no place for negative emotions or for genuine questioning about God's action and purpose. Indeed, it may work to silence the ordinary lay member altogether. Therefore, when designing liturgies or thinking through the focus of the liturgical seasons, I suggest that it's important to consider the way that the Psalms will be included and celebrated beyond their capacity to give voice to praise and thanksgiving. Once a psalm is chosen for inclusion, there are many ways that it may be presented. Now, I grew up in churches where we regularly had the call and response format, where the leader says the first line of the verse and the congregation responds with the second part. There is nothing inherently wrong with this format, and I believe that when used judiciously, it can be quite effective. It's particularly suited to things like the Hallel Psalms, Psalms 145 to 150, that provide a communal exhortation to praise. However, it's probably less suited to psalms that express individual grief or anger. So if we think about Psalm 94 here, we can imagine how the regular rhythm of congregational responses might strip this psalm of its emotion and therefore undermine the message. O Lord, you God of vengeance, shine forth. Rise up, O judge of the earth, give to the proud what they deserve. O Lord, how long shall the wicked exult, is really different from, O Lord, you God of vengeance, shine forth. Rise up, O judge of the earth, give to the proud what they deserve. O Lord, how long shall the wicked exult? As a small aside, the Sons of Korah do a really good rendition of this psalm. An individual reader can introduce some irregularity in the emphases that is not possible with the call and response format. In this psalm, while verse 1 and 3 both begin with the phrase, O Lord, an expressive reader will convey to the listener that the first is said in anger, while the third has an element of longing and wistfulness contained within it. In this way, the emotion of the psalm can be communicated and heard in a vastly different way through an individual voice. And of course, having an expressive and fluent reader can make all the difference. It can be quite painful to listen to poetry that either has no expression or is delivered badly. And I think this is more important than having an excellent reader for narrative passages, because with prose, the meaning is carried in a different way than it is for poetry. An analogous example would be Shakespeare, still performed in Old English. Even if the words individually might not be understood, the meaning can be conveyed through tone, cadence, and rhythm from a suitable actor. It's worth thinking too about the characteristics of the reader. Sociologists have developed the idea of a master status, that is, a characteristic of the individual that provides a primary identification. So if we look at this picture, we automatically approximate the age, gender, and race of the person pictured, and we treat them accordingly. I would suggest, unless there are clear signs to the contrary, that we would also assume they are able-bodied and heterosexual as well. There are also more subtle indications like dress and hairstyle and mannerisms that indicate to us class, level of education, and other personal characteristics. If I asked, you probably would be able to tell me this person's approximate age, their gender, and their race. Now, what I'd like you to do is imagine the words of Psalm 77 verse 4 in this person's voice. So this is my 20-year-old daughter Gemma, and while she's pictured in a beautiful field of sunflowers, the look of indignation on her face and her hands placed on her hips convey some of the message of this verse. If she was speaking in church, she probably or possibly would be dressed slightly more formally, and in certain churches she would have been told not to show so much skin. Now I'm going to show you a couple of other pictures, and I ask you to do the same thing. Imagine the person in the picture saying this verse. So what do the troubles for each of these people look like? What do they mean when they say they cannot speak? How do things like gender, age, and race impact the way we hear these verses? Does anything change if we know that they are queer? Does anything change if we know that they are disabled? If your church is anything like mine, it's overwhelmingly white, and the average age is probably upwards of 60, and it's predominantly women. However, if we counted the minutes or words spoken in my church, they would be overwhelmingly said by men. Because while we tend to have a good gender balance in guests, the minister is male. Of all the churches I've attended in my life, only one had a female minister in a permanent role. Of course, in the Lutheran Church of Australia and the Catholic Church, only men are allowed to be ordained. But even in more liberal denominations, men are more likely to be in positions of authority and are more likely to present from the front, while the women often serve in the kitchen at morning tea time. This changes the way we hear the message, especially if they are only cis, white, straight men. So while fluency and clear articulation are important, the characteristics of the individual reader are also vital to consider if we want congregants to be able to hear their own lived experience within the liturgical reading of the Psalms. This is particularly true for minorities and marginalised people who are less likely to hear their voice speaking with authority in a service of worship. So in this final section, I'm going to consider the imprecatory psalms, that is, the verses that call for the destruction of enemies. Most people are familiar with Psalm 137 that starts with a verse, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion." You might know the Boney M version, or "By the Willows" from Godspell, or any number of other musical renditions. The songs based on this psalm typically don't include the last three verses, which read, "Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down, down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock." This word happy at the beginning of verse 9 is asheri, the same word that I said at the start that can be translated as blessed. Now, I'm not sure which is worse, the idea that someone who dashes babies' heads against the rock is either happy or blessed. These are really hard verses to read. And part of me says that this is a post-exilic text, and the psalmist is only arguing for the same thing to happen to the Babylonians that has been perpetrated against the Israelites themselves. This might be understood as the psalmist calling for karmic justice against their enemies. But the other part of me thinks, especially thinking about my beautiful granddaughter, that no baby deserves this, regardless of the sins of their parents. And if we decide that all the psalms should be included within the lectionary or the liturgical seasons, that means that these verses would be read from the front of the church and could be seen to contain a biblical and theological injunction to repay to their enemies what they can be seen to deserve. Now I'm going to take a step back here and consider a related issue. Throughout the Psalms is this repeated notion of the enemies. So if we think of King David as the psalmist, the enemies might be foreign powers that threaten the united monarchy of Israel. At another moment in the narrative, the enemies might be Saul and his army who seek to kill David. At yet another moment, the enemies could be David's sons who plot to be the heir to the kingdom. This type of contextual reading emphasizes a masculine conceptualization, some would probably say a toxic masculinity, of the enemies. But it's certainly far removed from my experience, and I would venture to guess from the experience of most people here. However, even within the Hebrew Bible, there comes the sense that enemies is a much broader conception. Enemies can mean the opposing army, but it can also mean the neighbour who disagrees with us, and almost anyone in between. The enemies are any person or group of people who opposes God, or opposes Israel, or even opposes the psalmist. And often in the Psalms, there is no detail about who the enemy is, beyond the fact that they stand in opposition to the psalmist. So Psalm 80 verse 6 says, "You make us the scorn of our neighbours, our enemies laugh against them amongst themselves." The enemies in this psalm are just laughing at the psalmist, and perhaps the psalmist feels ashamed. Now, as a shame researcher, I don't want to diminish the harmful nature of shame. However, it's important to note that our conception of enemies in the Psalms should not be limited to war imagery. So back to Psalm 137, where this is imagery from war. Should we read Psalm 137, verses 7 to 9, and others like it within worship? I don't have a clear answer for this, because I believe that worship should be contextual and that decisions should be made that prioritise the health and safety of the community. But I will suggest some guidelines. Firstly, I would argue that these verses should not be spoken as a reading that might leave the impression that God thinks it's okay to repay evil for evil. There are enough other passages in the Hebrew Bible to refute this perception, so using it in such a way would be irresponsible. Secondly, that if they are to be used, it would be with suitable trigger and content warnings so that individuals who may be traumatised by dialogue with these words would have either time to mentally prepare or absent themselves from the conversation. Third, the perspective of members who have direct experience of war should be prioritised and treated with the utmost sensitivity. For some, these verses may prove healing as they're given permission to be angry and desire revenge, although the desire for an enactment of revenge would have to be clearly delineated. Feelings are always valid, however, behaviours that further harm are not acceptable, and this line needs to be made clear. For others, these verses may do further damage and promote spiritual harm if the individual hears that God or Yahweh approves of innocent children being the collateral damage in a battle or war. Fourth, and lastly, if you do choose to explore these verses, it might be good to do so within a small group where the mental health of all members can be considered and monitored. Now, I mentioned the Sons of Korah earlier. They are an Australian band that sings the Psalms, named for the Korahites in the Bible, who were presumed to be temple singers, but not the ones who led the revolt against Moses in Numbers 16. They have recorded a version of Psalm 137 that does include these verses. And singer and composer Matthew Jacoby states, Psalm 137 is a psalm that I have personally struggled with more than any. The lyrics shocked me, and I found the ferocity of the emotions portrayed in it hard to deal with, particularly the last line. I also found it hard to see how I could sing this and see any relevance in it for me. But he did find a way to deal with this psalm and these verses, and their lyrics say, Remember, Lord, what Edom did. Remember, O Lord, on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried, tear it down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy's the one who will repay you. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy's the one who will pay you for all the things you have done. Blessed is he who destroys your progeny. And then it goes back to repeating the line by the rivers. Interestingly, this song is on their album titled Redemption Songs, which is pictured here. I'm still not entirely comfortable with this way of dealing with it, but I find it is interesting to explore different options. I would suggest that the very worst thing we can do is totally ignore these verses and allow people to stumble over them without guidance or preparation. We do need to be honest about the painful elements of our faith tradition and our sacred texts, and as a community wrestle with the way we understand these passages today. So it feels like I am very much ending on a note of pain, and although I think this is the fine line alluded to in the title, in allowing the Psalms to speak to our pain, in having permission to voice our doubts, there can be both pleasure and pain, both blessing and struggle. And particularly when we understand that we're not alone in these difficult experiences. The psalmist understood, and reading the Psalms can be an incredibly cathartic experience. I guess I would suggest to you it's worth the pain. Good poetry almost always is. Thank you.